Ukraine facing the harshest demands yet. Let me take you back to June 15th of this year. That was the day the G7 finance ministers gathered in Italy to finalize what they called a landmark agreement for Ukraine, a $50 billion loan package, supposedly secured by frozen Russian assets. The headlines were historic move to support Ukraine, Putin's war chest seized to fund Kyiv's defense. The White House press secretary called it a decisive blow to Russia's ability to wage war. Even Zelensky himself took to social media to thank the West for its unwavering solidarity. But here's what they didn't tell: that $50 billion isn't a gift. It's a loan. And not just any loan, one that comes with conditions so severe they make the IMF's structural adjustment programs of the 1990s look like a charity bake sale. I've spent decades studying how great powers manipulate smaller states in moments of crisis, and let me tell you, this isn't about saving Ukraine. It's about breaking it in a way that serves someone else's interests. Now, I'm not saying the West is acting out of malice, though I'm not ruling it out either. What I am saying is that when you peel back the layers of this so-called rescue package, what you find isn't solidarity. It's a geopolitical trap, one that's been set with the precision of a chess grandmaster. And Ukraine? It's the pawn being sacrificed to keep the game going. The official what they want you to believe. The story goes like Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been an unmitigated disaster for Moscow. Sanctions have crippled its economy. The Ukrainian military, armed with Western weapons and intelligence, has fought the Russian war machine to a standstill. And now, with this $50 billion loan, backed by the interest from frozen Russian assets, Kyiv can finally secure its future. The message is the West is all in, Ukraine is winning, and Russia is on the ropes. The numbers seem to support this. The US has committed over $175 billion in aid to Ukraine since 2022. The EU has pledged another €80 billion. NATO has exited its eastern flank, with Finland and Sweden joining the alliance. And in May, the Biden administration finally approved the long-delayed $61 billion aid package after months of political wrangling in Congress. On paper, it looks like a united front. Even the language is carefully calibrated. When the G7 announced the loan, they framed it as a creative solution to avoid dipping into Western taxpayer funds. The frozen Russian assets, some $300 billion in central bank reserves, would generate interest, and that interest would service the debt. Ukraine gets the money up front, the West gets to claim it's not footing the bill, and Russia gets to watch its own money fund its defeat. It's the kind of narrative that makes for great sound bites. But there's a problem with this narrative. Several, actually. First, the math doesn't add up. That $50 billion loan? It's not just a one-time infusion. It's structured as a 10-year repayment plan, with interest rates that will balloon over time. Ukraine's GDP was $200 billion before the war. It's now half that. Its debt-to-GDP ratio is already over 100%, and that's before this new loan. The IMF, which has been overseeing Ukraine's economy since 2014, has already warned that Kyiv's debt is unsustainable. So how, exactly, is Ukraine supposed to pay this back? Second, the frozen Russian assets aren't actually being seized. They're being leveraged. There's a difference. Seizing them would require a legal process that doesn't exist under international law, at least, not without setting a precedent that could come back to haunt the West. China, for instance, holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. If the U.S. can freeze and repurpose Russian assets, what's to stop Beijing from doing the same to American holdings? The G7's solution is that they're using the interest from those assets, not the principal. But that interest amounts to maybe $3 to $5 billion a year. So where's the rest of the $50 billion coming from? The answer is future Ukrainian taxpayers. Or, more likely, future Western taxpayers, when Kyiv inevitably defaults. And third, this is the part that should really set off alarm bells, there's the fine PR. The loan agreement includes what's being called conditionality. In plain English, that means Ukraine doesn't get the money all at once. It gets tranches, released only if it meets certain benchmarks. And those benchmarks? They're not just about fighting the war. They're about remaking Ukraine's entire economy and political system. We're talking about privatization of state-owned enterprises, deregulation of labor markets, opening up Ukraine's agricultural land to foreign investors. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same playbook the IMF used in the 1990s, when it forced Russia to sell off its state assets at fire sale prices, creating the oligarch class that still plagues the country today. The difference this time? Ukraine doesn't have the luxury of time. It's being asked to restructure its economy while under siege. So Ukraine is being given a loan it can't repay, backed by assets that aren't actually being seized, with conditions that will effectively turn it into a neoliberal experiment, all while it's still at war. And the West is selling this as a victory. Here's where it gets interesting. The hidden facts behind the loan. Let's start with the most obvious: why now? The war has been going on for over 2 years. Ukraine's economy is in tatters. Its military is exhausted. So why is the West suddenly pushing this loan package with such urgency? The answer lies in Washington and Moscow. In Washington, the political calculus is simple. The Biden administration is facing an election in November, and Ukraine has become a political football. The Republican-controlled House spent months blocking aid, with figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz framing it as a waste of money. Even Donald Trump, who has a complicated relationship with Zelensky, has been vocal about his skepticism. The White House needed to win a way to show that Ukraine isn't just a bottomless pit for American dollars. Hence, the $50 billion. It's a way to shift the narrative from endless aid to self-sustaining support. But here's the loan isn't coming from the US. It's coming from the G7. And that's where things get murky. You see, the US has been quietly pressuring its European allies to take the lead on Ukraine's financial future. Why? Because Congress is getting restless. The $61 billion aid package passed in April was the last major tranche of US funding for the foreseeable future. The White House knows that if Trump wins in November, all bets are off. So the G7 loan is a way to lock in long-term funding without relying on an unpredictable Congress. But there's another layer to this. The loan is structured in a way that forces Europe to bear the brunt of the risk. If Ukraine defaults, and let's be honest, it probably will, the G7 will have to decide whether to restructure the debt or let Kyiv collapse. And if they choose the latter, the fallout won't just be economic. It'll be geopolitical. A bankrupt Ukraine would be a failed state on Europe's doorstep, a magnet for refugees, crime, and Russian influence. So in effect, the US is outsourcing the political headache to Brussels while still calling the shots. Now, let's talk about Moscow. The Russians aren't stupid. They know exactly what this loan, a last-ditch effort to keep Ukraine afloat long enough to force a negotiated settlement on Western terms. And they're not going to let that happen. Here's what's really going on behind the 1. Ukraine's neutrality. No NATO membership, ever. 2. Territorial concessions. At minimum, recognition of Russia's annexation of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. 3. Demilitarization. A permanent cap on Ukraine's military, enforced by international monitors. The West, for its part, has been signaling that it's open to some of these demands, but only if Russia agrees to a phased withdrawal and a path to EU membership for Ukraine. The problem? Neither side is willing to budge on the core issues. Russia won't accept a Ukraine that's still aligned with the West, and the West won't accept a Ukraine that's effectively a Russian vassal. So where does the $50 billion loan fit into this? It's a way to buy time. The West is betting that if it can keep Ukraine in the fight for another 12 to 18 months, Russia will either exhaust itself or face enough domestic pressure to sue for peace. But that bet assumes two: first, that Ukraine can hold out that long, and second, that Russia will play by the West's rules. Neither of those assumptions holds water. Let's start with Ukraine's military situation. The much-hyped 2023 counteroffensive was a disaster. Ukrainian forces lost over 70,000 men in 6 months of fighting, gained almost no territory, and expended vast quantities of Western-supplied ammunition. The Russians, meanwhile, have adapted. They've built layered defenses, ramped up domestic arms production, and integrated lessons from the early stages of the war. Their strategy now is grind down Ukrainian forces until Kyiv either collapses or agrees to terms. And then there's the manpower issue. Ukraine has already lowered the conscription age to 25 and is now considering mobilizing women. The country's population has shrunk by nearly 20% since 2014. The pool of available soldiers is drying up. The Russians, on the other hand, have a population of 140 million and a willingness to take casualties that the West can't match. They're also getting help from North Korea and Iran, which are supplying artillery shells, drones, and ballistic missiles. So the idea that Ukraine can hold out for another year and a half? It's wishful thinking. And the West knows it. Which brings us to the second that Russia will negotiate in good faith. Here's the Putin isn't interested in a deal that leaves Ukraine as a Western-aligned state. He's playing the long game. His goal isn't just to take territory, it's to break Ukraine as a functioning state and integrate it into Russia's sphere of influence. And he's willing to wait. The $50 billion loan doesn't change that calculus. If anything, it accelerates it. Because the harder the West pushes Ukraine to keep fighting, the more territory Russia takes. And the more territory Russia takes, the weaker Ukraine's negotiating position becomes. So what's really happening here? The West is trying to thread a needle that can't be threaded. It wants to support Ukraine without provoking a wider war with Russia. It wants to weaken Russia without triggering a collapse that could lead to nuclear escalation. And it wants to maintain its global hegemony without bankrupting itself in the process. It's not working. The exited geopolitical the great power struggle. To understand why this loan is such a pivotal moment, you have to out. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under a simple that it can maintain its position as the world's sole superpower indefinitely. That assumption is now being tested. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the relative decline of American economic and military dominance have created a multipolar world, one where the US can no longer dictate terms unilaterally. Ukraine is the first major battlefield in this new era. And the way this war plays out will set the tone for the next decade of great power competition. Let's break it down by the key players. The United, the hegemon in decline. The US is still the most powerful country in the world. But its power is eroding. Its debt-to-GDP ratio is over 120%. Its industrial base has been hollowed out. Its military is stretched thin, with commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And its political system is deeply polarized, making it difficult to sustain long-term strategies. The Biden administration's approach to Ukraine reflects this reality. On one hand, it wants to support Kyiv to demonstrate American resolve and deter future aggression. On the other hand, it can't afford to get dragged into a protracted war with Russia. So it's trying to have it both arm Ukraine just enough to keep it in the fight, but not enough to win. The $50 billion loan is the latest iteration of this strategy. It's a way to keep Ukraine afloat without committing more American troops or treasure. But it's also a gamble. Because if Ukraine collapses, the US will have to choose between escalation and humiliation. And neither option is appealing. The revisionist power. Russia's goals in Ukraine are: 1. Prevent NATO action. This has been a red line for Moscow since the 1990s. The idea of Ukraine joining NATO was a non-starter, and Putin made that clear in his 2021 ultimatum to the West. 2. Secure a buffer zone. Russia has always seen Ukraine as part of its near abroad. A neutral, demilitarized Ukraine would serve as a buffer against Western encroachment. 3. Weaken the West. Putin knows that a prolonged war in Ukraine drains Western resources and divides NATO. He's playing the long game, betting that the US and Europe will eventually tire of the conflict. The $50 billion loan plays right into this strategy. Because the harder the West pushes Ukraine to keep fighting, the more territory Russia takes. And the more territory Russia takes, the weaker Ukraine's position becomes. It's a classic case of asymmetric. Russia doesn't need to win on the battlefield. It just needs to outlast the West. The rising challenger. China is the wild card in this equation. On the surface, Beijing has been careful to maintain a neutral stance. Its call for peace talks, offered to mediate, and avoided direct military support for Russia. But behind China's goals are 1. Undermine U.S. hegemony. A prolonged war in Ukraine weakens the West and distracts the U.S. from Asia. That's good for China. 2. Secure Russian resources. China needs Russian oil, gas, and minerals to fuel its economy. A weakened but dependent Russia is in Beijing's interest. The $50 billion loan gives China an opening. If Ukraine defaults, China could step in with its own financial assistance on its own terms. It could demand access to Ukraine's agricultural land, its ports, or its industrial base. And if the West is too distracted to respond, China could effectively turn Ukraine into a client state. The divided house. Europe is the most vulnerable player in this conflict. It's dependent on Russian energy, exposed to Ukrainian refugees, and divided between hawks and doves. The $50 billion loan is a way to paper over those divisions. But it's also a band-aid on a bullet wound. The reality is that Europe can't sustain this war indefinitely. Its economies are stagnating. Its populations are aging. And its military capabilities are a fraction of what they were during the Cold War. The US is pushing Europe to take the lead on Ukraine, but Europe doesn't have the stomach for it. And that's the problem. Because if Europe falters, the US will have to choose between escalation and retreat. And neither option is good for the transatlantic alliance. Military and strategic: the illusion of control. Let's talk about the military situation. Because the way this war is being fought and the way it's being reported has created a dangerous illusion. The West has been operating under the assumption that it can control the escalation ladder. That it can arm Ukraine without provoking a direct conflict with Russia. That it can impose sanctions without triggering a wider economic war. That it can support a proxy without getting dragged into a quagmire. This is the same thinking that led to Vietnam. The same thinking that led to Iraq. The same thinking that led to Afghanistan. And it's just as flawed now as it was then. Here's what's really happening on the Russian military has adapted. In the early days of the war, Russia made a lot of mistakes. Its logistics were poor. Its command structure was rigid. Its troops were poorly trained. But that's changed. The Russians have learned from their failures. They've decentralized command, improved their logistics, and ramped up domestic arms production. They're now producing more artillery shells than the US and Europe combined. They've also changed their strategy. Instead of trying to take territory quickly, they're grinding down Ukrainian forces. They're using drones to target Ukrainian artillery. They're hitting supply lines with long-range missiles. And they're exploiting Ukraine's manpower shortages. The result? Ukraine is running out of soldiers, ammunition, and time. The West's arsenal is dwindling. The US has sent Ukraine over 2 million artillery shells since 2022. That sounds like a lot until you realize that Russia is firing 10 times that number per year. The US is now producing about 30,000 shells a month. Russia is producing 250,000. The same is true for air defense systems. Ukraine is burning through Patriot missiles at an unsustainable rate. The US has only a limited number of these systems, and they're needed for other theaters, like the Middle East and Asia. The bottom line? The West can't keep up. And the longer this war drags on, the more depleted its arsenals become. Escalation risks are real. The West has been playing a dangerous game of chicken with Moscow, assuming that Putin will always blink first. But what happens when he doesn't? What happens when the West's bluff is called not with a nuclear strike, but with a conventional escalation that leaves NATO staring down the barrel of a direct confrontation it isn't prepared for? Let me explain why this matters. The Biden administration has been operating under the delusion that it can arm Ukraine indefinitely without crossing Russia's red lines. But red lines aren't static. They shift. And right now, they're shifting in ways that should make every policymaker in Washington and Brussels lose sleep. Take the recent strikes inside Russia. For months, the US and its allies insisted that Ukraine could only use Western weapons to defend its own territory. Then, in May 2024, the White House quietly greenlit limited strikes on Russian soil near Kharkiv. A few weeks later, the UK and France followed suit, allowing their long-range Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles to be used against deeper targets. Now, there's talk of letting Ukraine hit military bases and even command centers inside Russia with ATACMS. Here's the uncomfortable: every time the West moves the goalposts, Russia recalibrates its response. And right now, Moscow is signaling that the next escalation won't be another round of sanctions or diplomatic protests. It'll be kinetic. Now, what most people don't realize is that Russia has been preparing for this moment for years. Since 2014, when the West backed the Maidan coup and Russia annexed Crimea, Moscow has been methodically restructuring its military and economy for a long war. The Russian defense budget has nearly doubled since 2021. Their arms industry is operating at full capacity, with factories running 24/7 shifts. And crucially, they've built up a stockpile of precision-guided munitions that can strike deep into NATO territory if provoked. Let's talk about those munitions for a second. The Kinzhal hypersonic missile, the Iskander-M ballistic missile, the Kalibr cruise missile, these aren't just weapons. They're tools of coercion. And Russia has been using them not just in Ukraine, but as a message to the West. Remember the strikes on Ukrainian power grids in 2022 and 2023? Those weren't just about degrading Ukraine's infrastructure. They were a demonstration of what Russia could do to NATO's energy and logistics hubs if the war escalates. The problem is, NATO isn't ready for this. The alliance's air defenses are stretched thin. The US has been sending Patriot systems to Ukraine, but those same systems are needed to protect American bases in Poland, Romania, and the Baltics. Europe's air defenses are even worse. Germany, for all its talk of Zeitenwende, still doesn't have enough Iris-T or Patriot batteries to cover its own territory. And the UK? Its air defenses are a joke compared to what Russia can throw at them. Now, imagine this: Ukraine, desperate to break the stalemate, launches a deep strike into Russia with Western missiles, hitting a military airfield or a command center. Russia responds not just with a counterstrike in Ukraine, but with a limited attack on a NATO logistics hub in Poland, say, Rzeszów, where most of the Western arms shipments are staged. What happens then? The Biden administration has been Article 5 is sacred. But here's the catch. Article 5 doesn't automatically trigger a full-scale war. It's a commitment to consult. And in a crisis, consultations can take days that Russia would use to consolidate its gains. Meanwhile, the US would be faced with an impossible escalate and risk a direct war with a nuclear-armed power, or back down and watch NATO's credibility collapse. This isn't hypothetical. It's exactly what happened in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US and the USSR came within a hair's breadth of nuclear war because neither side fully understood the other's red lines. The difference now? The stakes are even higher, and the margin for error is even smaller. Let me put this in historical perspective. In 1914, Europe sleepwalked into World War I because no one believed the other side would actually go to war over a single assassination. In 1939, Britain and France assumed Hitler would stop at Poland. In 1950, the US thought China wouldn't intervene in Korea. Every time, the establishment got it wrong because they assumed the other side would behave rationally. And yet, here we are again, making the same mistakes. The West assumes that Russia will always back down. That Putin won't risk a direct conflict with NATO. That the war will stay contained. But war has a logic of its own. And right now, that logic is pushing us toward a confrontation that no one wants but no one knows how to stop. The military implications are just as dire. Ukraine's manpower crisis isn't just a problem for Kyiv, it's a problem for NATO. The Ukrainian army is running out of soldiers, and the West isn't producing enough replacements. The US has been pulling troops from other theaters to train Ukrainian forces, but that's not sustainable. Europe? It's even worse. Germany, France, and the UK have all cut their defense budgets for decades. Their militaries are hollowed out, their stockpiles depleted. And then there's the question of time. The longer this war drags on, the more Russia's military-industrial complex ramps up. The more Ukraine's economy collapses. The more NATO's arsenals empty out. At some point, the West will have to double down and risk a wider war, or cut its losses and leave Ukraine to its fate. Neither option is palatable. But the longer we pretend we can have it both ways, the longer we arm Ukraine without preparing for the consequences, the worse the eventual reckoning will be. Here's what keeps me up: the West isn't just losing this war. It's losing the ability to deter the next one. Because if Russia can bleed Ukraine dry with impunity, what's to stop China from doing the same to Taiwan? What's to stop Iran from escalating in the Middle East? What's to stop North Korea from testing the limits of U.S. resolve? The uncomfortable truth is that the post-Cold War order is collapsing. And the West, for all its talk of rules-based internationalism, is the one holding the wrecking ball. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a military problem, it's a political one, and it's playing out in real time in Kiev, Washington, and Brussels. The establishment keeps treating this war like a chess match, where moves are calculated and consequences are predictable. But war isn't chess. It's more like poker, where the stakes keep rising, the bluffs get bigger, and eventually, someone has to show their hand. Let's start with Ukraine. Zelensky's government is caught between two impossible pressures. On one side, you have the West demanding reforms, anti-corruption measures, judicial overhauls, economic liberalization, all while Ukraine's economy is in freefall. GDP contracted by 30% in 2022, inflation hit 26% last year, and the hryvnia has lost nearly half its value since the war began. The IMF just approved a $15.6 billion bailout in March, but the conditions are austerity, privatization, and the kind of structural adjustments that would make even the most hardened neoliberal blush. Meanwhile, Ukraine's oligarchs, yes, they still exist, are quietly siphoning off whatever aid money they can, just like they did after 2014. Rinat Akhmetov, Ukraine's richest man, lost billions when Mariupol fell, but he's still got enough influence to block land reforms and keep his energy empire intact. The West turns a blind eye because, well, what's the alternative? Let Ukraine collapse? On the other side, you have the Ukrainian people, who are exhausted. The mobilization laws passed in April were supposed to fix the manpower crisis, but they've only deepened the resentment. Men are fleeing the country to avoid conscription. Poland alone has seen over 600,000 Ukrainian men cross its border since 2022. The ones who stay are being pulled from hospitals, factories, and farms, leaving critical sectors understaffed. And let's not forget the regional divides. Western Ukraine is still gung-ho about the war, but in the east and south, where the fighting is heaviest, the mood is different. There's a reason why Kherson and Zaporizhia have seen protests against mobilization. People there are living under Russian occupation, or close enough to it, and they're asking, what are we fighting for? The answer from Kiev is always the victory. But what does victory even mean anymore? The 2022 counteroffensives recaptured Kherson and Kharkiv, but since then, it's been a slow bleed. The 2023 offensive, which the West hyped up for months, failed spectacularly. Now, Ukraine is back on the defensive, and the best-case scenario is a frozen conflict, another Korea, another Cyprus, another decades-long stalemate. Here's the uncomfortable: Ukraine's political system wasn't built for this. Zelensky was elected in 2019 on a platform of peace, not war. He promised to end the Donbass conflict through negotiations, not force. But when the invasion came, he had no choice but to pivot. The problem is, he's now trapped in a war he can't win and can't afford to lose. Every time he talks about negotiations, the hawks in Washington and London accuse him of weakness. Every time he doubles down on the fight, the body bags pile up. And the longer this goes on, the more radicalized Ukrainian politics becomes. The far right, which was marginal before 2022, is now mainstream. The Azov Battalion, once a fringe neo-Nazi group, is now a regular unit in the Ukrainian army. The government has banned opposition parties, shut down dissenting media, and arrested critics under martial law. This isn't a democracy at war, it's a war state, where the rules of democracy no longer apply. Now, let's talk about the West, because this is where the real delusion lies. The Biden administration keeps insisting that Ukraine can win, that Russia is on the brink of collapse, that Putin's regime is fragile. But the numbers don't add up. Russia's economy grew by 3.6% in 2023, defying Western sanctions. Its military production is outpacing NATO's. Russia is now producing 3 times as many artillery shells as the US and Europe combined. And Putin? He's more popular than ever. His approval rating is hovering around 80%, and the Russian elite is united behind him. The Wagner mutiny last June was a blip, not a crisis. Prigozhin is dead, and Putin's grip on power is stronger than it's been in years. The West, meanwhile, is fracturing. The US is paralyzed by partisan gridlock. Congress took 6 months to pass the latest $61 billion aid package, and even then, it only squeaked through because Trump's opposition collapsed at the last minute. The Republicans are split between isolationists like Rand Paul, who want to cut off Ukraine entirely, and hawks like Mitch McConnell, who still believe in the old Cold War playbook. The Democrats, for their part, are terrified of looking weak, so they keep doubling down on a losing strategy. And Europe? It's even worse. Macron talks about sending troops to Ukraine, but France's military is a shadow of what it was in the 1990s. Scholz dithers, afraid of provoking Russia, while Germany's defense industry struggles to produce enough ammunition to meet its own needs, let alone Ukraine's. The UK is the only European country that's still fully committed, but even London is running out of steam. The British public is war-weary, and Sunak's government is more focused on the next election than the next battle. Let me explain why this matters. The West isn't just losing in Ukraine, it's losing its credibility. Every time we promise Ukraine a path to victory, every time we talk about NATO membership, every time we impose new sanctions that don't work, we're eroding trust. The global South is watching, and they're not impressed. India is buying Russian oil. China is selling Russia drones. Turkey is playing both sides. Even Saudi Arabia, America's oldest ally in the Middle East, is hedging its bets. The message is the West's word isn't worth what it used to be. So where does this leave us? There are 3 possible scenarios, and none of them are good. The first is escalation. NATO gets dragged in, either by accident or design. A Russian strike on a NATO supply depot in Poland. A Ukrainian false flag attack on a Russian nuclear facility. A miscalculation that spirals out of control. The result? A direct war between NATO and Russia, which would make Ukraine look like a skirmish. The US and Europe aren't ready for this. Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads. The last time we came this close to nuclear war was Cuba in 1962, and that was with leaders who were far more cautious than Putin. The second scenario is collapse. Ukraine's army breaks. The front lines crumble. Zelensky is overthrown in a coup, or flees to Poland. Russia takes Kiev, installs a puppet government, and declares victory. The West is humiliated, but at least the fighting stops. The problem? Russia won't stop at Ukraine. Moldova is and then the Baltics. Putin has made it he wants a sphere of influence, and he's willing to use force to get it. The question is, how far is he willing to go? The third scenario is stalemate. The war drags on for years, like Korea or Cyprus. Ukraine becomes a frozen conflict, a permanent bleeding wound on Europe's eastern flank. The West keeps funding it, but never enough to win. Russia keeps fighting, but never enough to lose. The result? A generation of Ukrainians displaced, a generation of Russians radicalized, and a new Iron Curtain descending across Europe. The Cold War never really ended, it just went dormant, and now it's back with a vengeance. Here's what keeps me up at night: none of these scenarios are inevitable, but all of them are possible. And the longer we pretend we can control the outcome, the worse it gets. The establishment keeps talking about strategy, but strategy implies control. And right now, no one is in control. Not Zelensky. Not Biden. Not Putin. The war has a logic of its own, and it's pulling us all toward a reckoning we're not prepared for. The real question isn't whether Ukraine can win. It's whether the West can survive the consequences of losing. Because if we do, the world won't be the same. And that's a price we're not ready to pay.